Saint Augustine wrote that God exists in the supreme sense, in the original sense of the word. He is altogether unchangeable, and it is He who can say with full authority, I am who I am. Indeed, Augustine correctly links the doctrine of aseity, that God is who He is, with the next doctrine we're going to look at, which is God's immutability. I'm Caleb Blada, and this is 6-Minute Theology, where you can learn simplified theology for your everyday life. And today we're going to look at the doctrine of God's immutability, or His unchangeableness. And I'm going to offer a very simple definition for today's video, and that is that God does not change in any way. Now, some people offer more qualifications or nuances, such as saying God doesn't change in His nature, His purpose, or His plans. But I'm going to stick with the classic definition that God does not change in any way. And we'll get into, in a separate video, we'll get into some objections to this doctrine. But for now, I want to lay some biblical ground for why we should believe in the doctrine of God's unchangeableness, and why this doctrine is so essential to who God is. And there's three main reasons I want to focus on. First, that God's immutability distinguishes Him from creation. Second, that God's immutability grounds His perfection. Third, that God's immutability guarantees His faithfulness. First, God's immutability distinguishes Him from the rest of creation. It's what makes Him God. In other words, if God could change, He would just be like the rest of creation. Plants change, animals change, humans change. In fact, change is in our nature. We are born, we grow, we reach adulthood, eventually we die. We are constantly changing. But Scripture testifies that this is one of the main things that distinguishes God from creation, is that unlike creation, God does not change. Numbers 23:29 says, God is not man that He should lie, or a son of man that He should change His mind. Has He said, and will He not do it? Or has He spoken, and will He not fulfill it? So again, the fact that God doesn't lie, the fact that God doesn't change His mind, that's what makes Him God as opposed to man. Now, some might say, well, this is talking about God's purpose, His will. It's not talking about God's nature. It's not saying that God's nature is unchanging. And this leads to the second point, that God's immutability grounds His perfection. If God could change, that would mean that He is either better now than He used to be, or He was good and He became less good over time. And whatever option you go with, this would completely undermine God's perfection. He would no longer be perfect. But because God doesn't change, we can trust that He is perfect and always will remain perfect. James 1:17 says this clearly. Every good gift and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. So the Father is the everlasting light with no variation, no shadow, and no change. And that's why we can rest assured that He truly is perfect. Thirdly, God's immutability grounds His faithfulness. Because God does not change, we can trust that His purposes won't change, that He won't abandon His promises. Isaiah 46:9-10 declares, I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all of my purpose. How terrifying would it be if God could change? How terrifying would it be if we couldn't read the promises in Scripture and trust that these promises were true? If you just think about a person you know who doesn't follow through on their word, you can't trust them. You have reservations about asking them to do even simple tasks. If this was the case with God, why would we trust Him? Why would we worship Him? Why would we love Him? He would not be perfect. We would have no assurance of his faithfulness, and He would be just as fickle as any one of the creatures we see around us. But because God does not change, we can trust that He is perfect. He is trustworthy, he is faithful, and he always will be God. But despite all these reasons, God's unchangeableness is tragically under attack today. And so we're going to spend the next video diving into some of those attacks and explaining how can we defend the doctrine of God's unchangeableness. Until then, thank you for watching 6-Minute Theology, and stay tuned to learn more simplified theology for your everyday life.